So, there was a piece of news that came out recently where a famous or popular Filipina golfer named Yuka Sasso recently gave up her Filipino citizenship to acquire Japanese citizenship, if I'm not mistaken. And this is what she said, and I quote: I am a Filipina, born in the Philippines to a Japanese father and Filipino mother. I was raised in both Japan and the Philippines. I am immensely proud of my dual heritage, and that will never change. And then I asked myself, wow, what a wonderful world. No, what I asked myself was, if I had to choose between my two citizenships, which one would I choose? So the question is, would you give up your citizenship to live in a new country? And I've observed this recently, or rather in the past 2 years. I've noticed friends who've moved to Singapore move on to other countries. I'm sure some of these friends wanted to settle down here in Singapore, but it's pretty strict here. Even people who've lived here for many years, any Filipinos who have lived here for many years, they get their permanent residency application rejected maybe 5, 6, 7, up to 10 times. It's kind of ridiculous. And of course, you want to settle down in a new country, right? I'm not going to talk about immigration or any of that policy, but what I've observed with Filipinos is that they move on to other countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and I've seen them, take part in these once they've moved on to these other countries, they take a citizenship, what do you call it, an oath, and they let go of their Philippine citizenship so they could take on, being a citizen of Australia, Canada. In my case, a little bit about me. I am a dual citizen. I recently reacquired my Filipino citizenship in 2019, 2 years ago, and I'm really proud of that. I felt it made sense. I was born in the 1980s in the United States, and in the United States, if you're born on U.S. soil, you're an American citizen. So I was born on the East Coast. My dad was in the military. My mom followed from the Philippines, and when I was born in that year, my mom was still a Filipino citizen when I was born, when she gave birth to me. But since I was born on the East Coast of the United States, I was an American citizen. I grew up in the United States. I grew up in many countries, actually. I even spent time in Japan since my dad was in the military. And you can say my upbringing is American or Filipino American. But my dad retired in 1998. And normally, well, I'd like to say normally you retire to the United States, continue life as we knew it in California, in San Francisco. But what happened was my dad was adamant on retiring in the Philippines, which is basically the opposite direction of what most people were like in his time. And I was a 13-year-old kid who was suddenly moving to the Philippines. I didn't have a problem moving to the Philippines. In fact, at the time I may have said things to my parents, out of anger. I mean, what do you expect from a 13-year-old who grew up in the United States, who is suddenly being told that you have to move to the Philippines? And I thought the Philippines, as it's portrayed in media or in the movies, it's a place that's so hot and traffic and mosquitoes, and where coming from my family, it's a huge family. Every time we would come home to the Philippines on vacations when I was a kid, it felt like some massive homecoming affair, and balikbayan boxes and chocolates and lots of relatives just staring at you. That's just from my point of view as a little kid, that was the Philippines for me. Hold on, we're not talking about my childhood in the Philippines. What I'm saying was, I moved to the Philippines in 1998, and I was a permanent resident in the Philippines ever since. For about 20 years, from 1998 to 2019, I was a permanent resident there. I wasn't a citizen. My dad applied for dual citizenship for the family, and only my mom, my dad, and my brother could get theirs, and mine was just, I'm not sure if it was a mistake in filing. What happened was my parents were eligible to reclaim their Filipino citizenship since, they were originally Filipino citizens. My brother was below 18 when they applied for him, so he was like a dependent. So his acquisition of Filipino citizenship was pretty fast in 2005. Um, as for me, I was a permanent resident, or you could say I had a alien certificate of registration. It's an ACR for short, and I was no different from a Korean foreign exchange student in the Philippines, if you think about it. And I carried that through to 2019, partly because I moved to Singapore and I didn't have time to process the paperwork. But it was ridiculous coming home to the Philippines and leaving, and every time you would, if you're a permanent resident in the Philippines or you had an ACR I card or identity card, you had to pay about 4,000 pesos at the airport every time you exit the Philippines, which is fucking ridiculous. And and you had to pay these express lane fees at the airport. An express lane fee does not exist. You had to pay 500 pesos on top of your whatever fee you need to pay as a foreigner in the Philippines just to get your paperwork processed. There's no such thing as an express lane fee. That is part of the whole red tape in the Philippines. I think the recent government, the administration, has removed the express lane fee, thankfully. And that's probably the most direct help that I've felt from the current administration. So anyways, in 2019, I reacquired my Filipino citizenship, and it felt so good it made absolute sense when finally I had a brown passport, the Filipino passport, together with my American passport, and I had both. And I felt like it made sense. I felt like I could, and you'd ask, which passport do you use where? And it's quite simple. In Singapore, I am registered as an American, and all my paperwork is tied to my U.S. passport. So in Singapore, I'm an American citizen. If I were to travel to other ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, especially Vietnam, the Philippines passport, you're exempted from visas that are required in some of these other Southeast Asian countries. Whereas if you use your American passport, you'd have to pay like a visa on arrival, VOA, for about $30-$40 each time. So it depends on my destination. But I'm cherishing both passports right now. Yeah. That said, when I saw this article about this Japanese golfer, making a decision to acquire Japanese citizenship, I was wondering, here she was at the recent Tokyo Olympics representing the Philippines in golf. And here she is suddenly choosing to acquire Japanese citizenship. And many practical people, doesn't make a big deal. But perhaps a third culture kid like me, it made me wonder for a moment, like, what if the United States or the Philippines only requires one citizenship? Like Singapore. Singapore, you can only have one citizenship. There's no such thing as a dual citizenship. And then I was thinking, what would I do? I actually divided it into two things. What is practical and what is ideal? When you ask yourself about having to choose your citizenship, not everyone is going to be a freaking celebrity. You can be, if you're going to be, what I'm trying to say is people choose their citizenships to acquire new citizenships for practical reasons. Those people that I mentioned who had moved on to Canada, New Zealand, Australia, or had left the Philippines, it's not that they're turning their backs on being Filipino. That is ridiculous thinking. Not at all. These people have families. They want to start families. They want to settle down. They've been living abroad for several years, maybe 10, 15 years already. And, going back to the Philippines in your 30s and your 40s, when you're mid-career, probably doesn't make sense. They need to sustain a lifestyle for their young children, so that's why they'd go to Australia to acquire Australian citizenship. Practical reasons, money, lifestyle, those are understood. The other one is idealism. I don't think you're going to see that too much. If I had to choose between being Filipino and American, for practical reasons, I'm already carrying the American passport. I was born American. I'll keep it. I'll choose to remain a U.S. citizen because it's for practical reasons. I'm not a celebrity. I'm not an influencer. And in my career, I feel like I'd love to afford myself opportunities. I believe in the American values. freedom, innovation, industry, those things I believe in. If I had to choose between the two, I'd keep my American citizenship. But that doesn't mean turning my back on my Filipino heritage. And if I could do things to celebrate both Filipino and American, there is a Filipino American community, I'd love to contribute to that. As for the golfer Yuka Sasso, I'm sure she has her reasons, and she said it in her statement. She said that she is immensely proud of her dual heritage, and that will never change. I agree with her 100%. I'd love to be a champion of both cultures. Actually, there is a culture developed from both. It's like a marriage of both. I really see that. It shouldn't be a thing to choose between to choose between two countries for your citizenship, but rather how you could you could marry both the better values of both countries that you're part of. United States, Philippines, if you could champion that friendship between the two, that's how I see it. Not everyone's going to agree with me. I think some people will say that, you got to choose one, you got to be loyal to one, but I know myself. I choose because I have to choose what's practical for me. All right, that's the end of this episode of Are You Local? I have some interviews lined up in the next few weeks and hope to finally get them published. Thanks for listening. All right,